Whether it be the Washington Monument, the Statue of Liberty, or the White House, the U.S. has no shortage of national symbols. However, one particular monument that is truly iconic and absolutely stunning from an artistic point of view is Mount Rushmore, a massive collection of 60-foot-tall sculptures carved into the southeast side of South Dakota's Black Hill Mountains, featuring the likeness of 4 of the country's most influential presidents throughout history. This site is one of the most visited tourist attractions in the U.S. and has been an important emblem of American history and culture ever since its completion. But have you ever wondered why it was created? How it was created, and why these 4 presidents were the only ones chosen to be recreated in granite? Well, if the answer is yes, then stay tuned, because today we discover the history of Mount Rushmore. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Far before Mount Rushmore became a national monument under the administration of the U.S. National Park Service, the history of this 6,000-foot tall mountain itself is also very interesting. The mountain was referred to as the 6 grandfathers by the Dakota people, the Native American tribe who inhabited the area prior to American acquisition of the territory. However, to Americans, the mountain was called many things, such as Keystone Cliffs, Slaughterhouse Mountain, or Sugarloaf Mountain, but in a legal sense, it had no official name until the late 1880s. The story behind how Mount Rushmore got its name is actually quite peculiar. In 1885, a New York lawyer named Charles E. Rushmore traveled to South Dakota and was surveying the area, looking for gold. He was accompanied by a guide, and upon reaching the mountain that would become the famous Mount Rushmore, he asked the guide what the name of this beautiful mountain was, to which the guide replied, quote, "It's never had one till now. We'll call this thing Rushmore." Since then, maps started to call the location Mount Rushmore, or at least some variation of the New York lawyer's surname, and it simply stuck over time. Fast forward a few decades, and during the economic and innovative period of the Roaring '20s, several Americans were interested in constructing some type of significant and large memorial in the Black Hills. Then, in 1923, a man named Don Robinson, who was the state historian of South Dakota, wanted to create a memorial dedicated to the American Southwest and their culture. The original plan was to have the likeness of several famous Wild West folk heroes and Native American figures such as Lewis and Clark, Red Cloud, Buffalo Bill Cody, and a few others carved into a large rock formation at Cluster State Park. However, Gutzon Borglum, the Danish-American sculptor who was hired to oversee and design the project, reviewed the location at Cluster State Park and ultimately decided against it. He concluded that the rock formation was too brittle and already too eroded to survive the sculpting. Even still, he was open to the idea of a rock carving memorial within the Black Hills, but in order to go ahead with the project, he requested some major changes, one of which was a change of venue. You see, instead of hosting the memorial at Cluster State Park, the memorial would instead be engraved into Mount Rushmore, which consisted of a much stronger granite rock. Also, instead of just American Southwest culture, the memorial would now celebrate American culture and history in general. In order to do that, Borglum proposed building sculptures of the most influential U.S. presidents to symbolize the United States' first 150 years as a sovereign nation, as well as the path up to that point. He eventually narrowed it down to what he felt were the 4 most important presidents, with each one representing a new era of American history. We'll have a look at each president in depth shortly, but in summary, George Washington was chosen to symbolize the creation of the United States, while Thomas Jefferson was chosen to represent the expansion of the U.S., as well as the new governmental and cultural changes. Then, Abraham Lincoln marks the country's perseverance and survival through the Civil War. And finally, we have Theodore Roosevelt being a symbol for the U.S. growing even stronger domestically, allowing the country to become a global power, leading up to the modern era. The plans for this memorial were completed in 1925, but construction did not start until 1927, after President Calvin Coolidge's official dedication. Construction would be finished 14 years later, but unfortunately the work was often not continuous and the project as a whole faced many obstacles. For example, finding sufficient funds was always a constant problem, with the project often running out of money, forcing a halt to construction. The federal government was able to provide about $1 million, but the rest had to come from private donations. In fact, upon hearing about the memorial's construction, Charles E. Rushmore himself donated to help out the project. There were also some issues with the design itself. Initially, Borglum planned to sculpt a bust of each president, including their shoulders, torsos, and necks, along with their heads obviously, but it quickly became evident that this was not feasible. There were also specific issues with the sculpture of Jefferson, who had to be redone and moved from its original spot on Washington's left shoulder to his right. To make matters even worse, Glutzen Borglum himself died just as the memorial was almost finished, but luckily his son, Lincoln, was able to take over and see out his father's vision. Despite many hardships and shortfalls, construction was finally completed in October of 1941, and from a design point of view, the changes and deviations from the original plan didn't hinder the project overall, as it was still an absolute marvel to look at. Surprisingly, of the 14 years of construction, only around 6.5 involved actual sculpting of the granite in the mountain. The rest of the time was essentially wasted due to lack of funds or weather issues. Borglum's plan started off with the use of various explosives, such as dynamite, to blow apart the surface and open up space for the sculptures. Then crews made up of hundreds of workers used jackhammers, chisels, and drills to bore massive holes into the side of the mountain. In between these holes is where the rock would be chipped away, leaving a smooth granite surface. This then allowed the team of former miners turned sculptors under the watchful eye of Borglum to construct the heads of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt into the rock. The workers sculpted each head using balsa chairs, which were lowered down the side of the mountain by cranks, while callboys would shout up and down the mountain to communicate. This hard and dangerous work paid off, and Washington's head was finally finished in 1934, Jefferson's in 1936, Lincoln in 1937, and Roosevelt in 1939. When all was said and done, over 450,000 tons of rocks were removed from Mount Rushmore, with much of it left at the base of the memorial. Public reaction was strong. Due to its obvious, audacious nature, Mount Rushmore very quickly became one of the iconic national images of the United States. To this day, Mount Rushmore is one of the most visited tourist attractions in the country, with over 2 to 3 million visitors every year. As a result, the entire site's infrastructure has been upgraded and expanded on several occasions in order to accommodate the growing amount of guests, as well as make the general experience more pleasant. For example, a special walkway that visitors take on their way to the mountain, called the Avenue of Flags, was opened in 1976, featuring 56 flags of U.S. states and territories on either side of the path, hence the name. Then, in 1998, the Grand View Terrace was added, giving the audience an even better sight of the mountain. That same year, the President Trail was constructed, allowing tourists a close-up view. Then, finally, the Lincoln Borglum Museum was added, displaying the history of Mount Rushmore and its construction. So now that we have a grasp on the general history of this monument, let's take a deeper look at each president that was represented in Mount Rushmore and why they were immortalized in granite. George Washington is probably the most recognizable and iconic president of all time, so it's no surprise that he's included on Mount Rushmore. Washington himself was born in the Virginia colony and rose to prominence in the British Army, where he learned to overcome many harsh obstacles and how to lead men. Afterwards, Washington became a successful statesman and landowner before entering service once more, being appointed as the commander of the Continental Army at the start of the American War for Independence. This was due to his previous military experience and widespread popularity as a leader leader among the revolutionaries. During the war, Washington again had to face many disadvantages, but in the end, his unconventional yet brilliant tactics led the colonies to victory as they won independence from Britain. Curiously, it's been said that Washington had the opportunity to hold on to power as a military dictator, but he gracefully decided to resign and leave the Continental Congress to build the new nation themselves. However, upon the adoption of the Constitution, Congress unanimously elected Washington as the first president of the United States of America in 1788, as they felt there was no one better suited to lead their nation. Washington then set the precedent for what it means to be an American head of state, but by doing so, he would go on to solidify some of the core values and ideals for which the country had stood for as well. Washington did not have any party affiliation. In fact, he actually warned the nation against political parties, but his own personal federalist ideology was essential to forging the United States into a powerful and unified country, rather than a loosely organized confederation of 13 autonomous states. He did so through many methods, such as promoting nationwide trade and business, strengthening nation unity by keeping the Union together, and defending American borders. All in all, building a Federalist legacy that would live on within the next administration run by John Adams. With that being said, though, what is perhaps even more important is actually what Washington did not do. For example, he recognized the delicate position the nation was in and didn't involve the U.S. in any foreign affairs which could have indebted the U.S. to a larger power, gotten American troops killed, or simply spent time and money which would have been badly needed to help domestic issues instead. Washington did not enter into any international alliances, and he also did not involve the U.S. in the chaotic and destructive French Revolution. Furthermore, while he had every opportunity to do so, Washington resisted the temptation of absolute power for a second time, stepping down from the presidency after 2 terms. Many historians have suggested that he could have easily stayed for the rest of his life, as at that moment there were no restrictions in term limits, not to mention his immense popularity. Many have hypothesized that back then he could have expanded the power of the executive branch while overriding Congress and solidifying himself as an authoritarian. Yet to the contrary, Washington chose modesty, while also recognizing what the U.S. desperately needed at the time was a secure, democratic republic, not an authoritarian state. In summary, George Washington saw the U.S. at a crossroads with many options to choose from. Ultimately, the decision he made led the country to what it is today, making him more than worthy of his spot on Mount Rushmore. While the legacy of George Washington ushered in a necessary age of federalism, Thomas Jefferson would create a necessary era of democratic republicanism, with the two differing ideologies spanning America's first political parties by the same names. In fact, Jefferson's democratic republican motivations would be spurred by his rejection of Washington's federalist learnings. In today's world, one may say that American politics are a fight between liberals and conservatives, or Democrats and Republicans. But in the nation's earliest days, the constant tug of war between Federalists and Democratic Republicans is what the political landscape was built upon. In hindsight, the two sides of the argument both had many valid convictions as well as visible flaws, but the inevitable compromise as a result of the political back and forth built the American society that still lives today, for better or worse. For example, the federalism that Washington set forth kept the nation together, constructed a unified American identity, and protected the new and fragile system of government. But if left unchecked, this federalist version of the U.S. could have quickly evolved into an authoritarian state, built upon greed, corruption, and generational nepotism. In stepped in Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, who valued strict meritocracy and the evolution of the self-made common American man, while looking to curtail the elitist establishment. Jefferson, who was a scholar, political philosopher, former ambassador and most famously the writer of the Declaration of Independence, also had a strong reputation and was elected in a statement victory in 1800 on the basis of decentralization and handing more political power to the self-made American landowner. After Jefferson's election, the nation would remain under Democratic-Republican rule, and they shaped it in their vision, shrinking both the central government and the military. But Jefferson also greatly expanded the U.S. as a country in terms of land, purchasing the Louisiana Territory from France. Jefferson's legacy also set the stage for nearly 2.5 decades of Democratic-Republican control over the government, which also included the presidencies of James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. While the Democratic-Republican Party would eventually fall apart decades later, Jefferson's influence could still be seen in the newly formed Democratic Party, which arose in its ashes. In its early stage, this new party backed anti-establishment populism and was championed by presidents such as Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and James K. Polk. Much like Washington, Jefferson's presidency predominantly changed the country and ushered in a new age. As was said before, in the early days of the United States, there was a constant political struggle between the two ideologies of federalism and democratic republicanism. In many ways, this tension continued into the 19th century, but instead of being shrouded in political ideology, the dichotomy took on a new face, with both the North and the South regions of the U.S. struggling to shape the country in their own distinct visions. The twofold partisan conflict that divided the nation was now based on geography and culture. The North wanted the U.S. to focus on an industrialized economy that regularly engages in international trade, is supported by large cities, and is backed by a large and watchful central government. On the other hand, the South wanted the U.S. to be centered around an agricultural-based economy that would be completely self-sufficient, while the government is small, decentralized, and largely keeps out of people's business. As with before, the country as a whole benefited from the compromise of the two, as both sides had advantages and flaws. But what would drastically change this nation was the growing issue of slavery. As it was this problem that became a lens for which the North versus the South debate was now seen through the entirety of the country, facing a moral dilemma against the sinful practices of the time. For decades, Americans had been trying to end or at least contain slavery, but they faced backlash from the Deep South. This issue was complex. Some had absolutely no qualms with the practice, while others disagreed entirely. Yet sometimes that wasn't enough, as many recognized that the Southern economy relied upon it. Regardless of slavery itself, many Southerners viewed the North as trying to encroach upon its region as a whole and impose a foreign culture onto them. As a result, slavery remained, and it soon became a predicament that was slowly tearing the U.S. apart. The tension would reach new heights in the 1850s with the further expansion of the U.S. and whether or not those new states would allow slavery, resulting in the rise of a new anti-slave party, the Republican Party, led by none other than Abraham Lincoln, a modest yet prominent lawyer and senator. Unfortunately, the situation grew so far out of hand that it seemed only a violent conflict could settle the issue once and for all. And so it was. With Lincoln's 1860 election, the outbreak of the Civil War began. With America facing her most detrimental crisis in her history, Lincoln stepped up and ensured that the Union stayed together, as well as finally ending slavery. Lincoln used all the available power at his disposal, organizing the war effort, and eventually achieved victory through a war of attrition after several early obstacles. One of Lincoln's greatest qualities was his ability to think ahead, and after the North defeated the South militarily, Lincoln knew he had to reincorporate the former Confederacy back into the U.S., not only to avoid a resurgent rebellion in the future, but also because his ultimate goal was the preservation of the Union, and he still viewed the Southerners as American brothers, despite their grave differences. Lincoln had grand plans for national healing, but unfortunately, he would not be able to see his plans go through completely, as he was assassinated just after the war concluded. While many crucial issues remained unsolved, Lincoln did achieve his goal by keeping the Union together and saving the United States from destruction. Much different from the other presidents on Mount Rushmore is Theodore Roosevelt. Coming from a well-grounded background that taught him both virtue and discipline, Roosevelt would rise to prominence as a writer and an assemblyman who cracked down hard on corruption, the governor of New York and a war hero for his service in the Spanish-American War. Due to his long list of achievements, as well as his great charisma, Roosevelt would be nominated vice president by William McKinley. But upon McKinley's tragic assassination in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt himself would rise to the occasion as the President of the United States. While the previous presidents we have looked at all faced the U.S. nation stuck at a crossroads, Roosevelt came into office upon a rather unified country, one that was also powerful economically due to the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, his goals and expectations were unique and unlike anything past U.S. presidents had experienced, and not dissimilar to Washington. Roosevelt ultimately set a precedent for future administrations in many ways. The president found himself tasked with taking the U.S. to a new level of greatness, as opposed to mending a domestic split, which had largely been done already. The strong economy and innovation of the time meant Roosevelt also faced the issue of excess, which manifested itself in the form of political and corporate corruption. Before looking outward, Roosevelt worked hard and found much success in cleaning up corruption at home. He protected the common American by signing many acts that broke up trusts, secured the free market, allowing small businesses to flourish, and laid out necessary regulation. Roosevelt deeply loved his nation, not just the people and the culture, but also the physical land itself, and he protected it by enacting many land preservation acts, which maintained valuable natural resources, as well as shielded the national beauty from the rapidly expanding industrialization. In his legacy, a strong consensus has been that while the U.S. strengthened domestically, Roosevelt then ushered in an era of American excellence on a global level. First, he built up the U.S. Navy so that it was one of the most powerful in the world, and then he famously built the Panama Canal, which not only benefited U.S. trading routes but also freed trade for the entire world. Roosevelt also believed that the U.S. should take a virtuous role in international relations. For example, personally mediating peace between Japan and Russia, who were in the course of war. Roosevelt also used U.S. military power to protect Latin America from European exploitation. Apparently, the reason for this intervention was to stop instability or political chaos and keep the region secure in the American sphere of influence. Roosevelt's ambitious and righteous legacy propelled the U.S. to a new position both at home and abroad, with the U.S. now being permanently changed as a whole. This legacy also lived on to some degree in the next administrations of Taft and Wilson, who both carried a form of early progressivism. When Gutzon Borglum decided to alter the project on his own accord to pay tribute to American history by building the Mount Rushmore Memorial, his choice to specifically honor the four presidents of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Theodore Roosevelt speaks a lot about the legacy that each of these men imprinted on the nation they used to lead. Whether it be from Washington, who unified the country and set the standard, Jefferson, who championed meritocracy and the elevation of the common man, Lincoln, who held the nation together, or Roosevelt, who took the U.S. to new heights, perhaps Borglum was correct choosing these four men, who all greatly shaped America. But I'd be curious to hear your take on the story. Do you believe that these four presidents are deserving for such a grand monument? If not, why? And who should be there in their place? Let us know in the comments section below. Hit that subscribe button to catch new videos every Thursday and Saturday, and consider supporting our channel by clicking join. Until next time, this is Ryan Sokash signing off.